Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the board of NHS England. My name is Penny Dash, and I am Chair of NHS England. First of all, I'd like to apologise for starting this meeting 30 minutes late. Apologies to both people who are here, and for those people who are here, thank you very much for joining us. You are always welcome. And to anybody looking at this online. Unfortunately, we were slightly encumbered by the trains. So apologies for that. We will make up a bit of time, but we've got enough time to have a full and proper discussion on everything that we need to. We do have some apologies from Louise Ansari and Jeremy Townsend, two of our NEDs, and from Meghana Pandit and Aidan. Welcome to you for joining, and Claire Fuller is also unable to be here. In terms of declaration of interest, those are all published. Does anyone have anything that has not been published? No? Okay, so before we get into the content, just want to do introductions for everybody. So if everyone could go round the table and say who they are and what their role is. And Jo, we'll start with you.
Jo Lenihan, Interim Director General of People.
Mark Cubban, National Director for Plan Care.
Amanda Doyle, National Director for Primary Care and Community Services.
Aidan Fowler, National Director of Patient Safety and Deputy Medical Director, covering for Meghana Pandit.
Matthew Style, Director General for System Development.
Sam Everington, Non-Executive Director and a clinician.
Hello everybody, Sarah Jane Marsh, National Director of UEC and Operations.
David Bennett, Non-Executive Director.
Jules Hunt, Interim Director of Technology, Digital and Data.
Robert Leckler, Non-Executive Director.
Elizabeth Omani, Interim Director General of Finance.
Jim Mackey, Chief Executive.
Andrew Morris, Deputy Chair.
Dr. Burton, Chief Nursing Officer.
Paul Corrigan, Non-Executive Director.
Rob Checkett, Strategic Advisor with responsibility for communications.
David Probert, Deputy CEO, NHS England and Interim Director General, Performance and Delivery.
Ravi Gurumurthy, Non-Executive Director.
Mark Bailey, Non-Executive Chair of the Digital Data and Technology Committee.
Glenn Burley, Financial Reset and Accountability Director.
Tom Cabassi, Executive Director of Strategy.
John Lester, Director of Corporate Governance.
Great, thank you very much. So first item is the minutes from the last board meeting. Does anyone have any comments or any questions on those? No? Okay, so we'll take those as accurate and approve those. So we're going to come on to updates from different committees. Start with the Strategy Committee and David.
Yes. So we had our first inaugural meeting a few weeks ago. Covered four topics. First of all, agreeing our terms of reference under a remit to ensure we deliver against, the NHS, deliver against our strategic priorities as set out in the 10-year health plan. Secondly, talking about how we can establish consistent methodology and approach to all the different work that needs to go on to achieve our strategic priorities. Thirdly, taking a look at all the work that is currently going on. And then finally, talking about how we make sure that we are covering all the appropriate topics in the right way.
Does anyone have any comments or questions? So I think just one from me, David. How much do you think you'll be able to cover sort of on an annual cycle, and what do you think are the key priority topic areas that we should be getting going with?
Well, the coverage, we talked about having 15 priorities for the committee, which sounds like rather a lot, but I think those won't all be going on at the same time. So I think we're probably looking at 5 or 6 topics that we will want to actually do deep dives into and really focus on. I think in the current position, where we really need to focus is on thinking about how we pull all of the different initiatives that are going on together. And that's both an issue of narrative. How do you tell a story that explains how all this fits together to achieve the objectives of the 10-year health plan? But also at a very quantitative level, how in numbers terms, in money, in people and so on, does this all add up? So I think that'll be a particular focus in the short term.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so Andrew, you're going to do finance, performance and people.
Thank you. So we had our first finance and performance meeting. We look at every aspect of performance. It's certainly a big kind of horizon of things. And there's been a big focus on financial delivery for this year. So you've got the notes in the meeting there. I just want to pick out 3 points, if I may. The first one is around deficit support. So we've put in 2 billion this year, mainly into providers and some systems. A lot of time has been devoted, if you look at Elizabeth and Jim's time, in trying to ensure that boards deliver their respective financial target, because it's really, really important that they do, and any slippage has a significant impact on our overall numbers. So we've agreed that the deficit support regime should last a maximum of 3 years, this being the first of those 3 years, or second?
Year zero.
Year zero, okay, sorry. And we obviously want to wean ourselves off it for clear reasons. Second point is around capitation. And the NHS has lots of debates over time around how fast do we move to capitation. But we feel we should make some fairly swift progress, recognising there are significant funders in terms of capitation. And that, in essence, we don't want to destabilise the ones who are at the other end of the scale. So we want to do that over a kind of timely way. And the third thing is around system reform in terms of payment systems. So we've approved the 20% marginal rate for ED activity for next year, and using the tariff to deliver bigger strategic shifts in terms of shifts to community, outpatient reform in particular, and also looking at best practice tariffs and how we can utilise those to change the way we operate our services, particularly in the shift from acute into community. So they're the kind of 3 big things that I think the meeting focused on.
Okay. Questions? Observations? The answer, people. Okay, so 3 things to pick up, if I may. The first one is around voluntary redundancy scheme. The scheme is now open, and it was signed off by the committee. And as in previous mergers, the People Committee has agreed to take an overview. We've got a further meeting on the 17th of this month, mainly to ensure that the arrangements that are in place are fair and equitable, and to ensure that basically there's no adverse equality impact. We did this last time round with the last restructuring, and we feel we ought to focus as a committee on this. We've got our next meeting on the 17th, as I say, and then we'll just take stock on how many people have come forward and what the arrangements are going forward in terms of timetabling. Second point is around recruitment of chairs and NEDs. So there's a national appointments team pushing forward a recruitment campaign. We intend to try and recruit people from all sectors, from all walks of life, who've got lots of experience to offer the NHS. And we particularly want to focus on diversity, trying to appeal to a younger cadre of people to join boards, trying to appeal to people from the private sector in particular, and also trying to urge employers to encourage some of their directors to join the NHS as a non-exec, and the same will apply to chairs. And there's a shortage in some parts of the country in terms of getting good NEDs, and it's really, really important that we do this work very, very thoroughly. So the programme of recruitment rollout, I think, will be key going forward, and we'll hopefully get a really, really fantastic response. The third thing is around culture. So we had a conversation around the organisational development of the new entity, DH and NHS England,
And I think we do need to spend a bit of time on culture. What is it that we want to see? What is it the staff want to see going forward? How can we create something that's very different and very new? We said we would do this when we had the last merger, and 2 years on we're having to focus on this again. But I think it's really, really important. And meanwhile, we need to do business as usual in terms of appraisals and being a good employer. So I think that's a big focus for the People Committee going forward. And incidentally, Louise should be doing this presentation. I'm just her mouthpiece for today. Thank you. Oh, sorry, one final point. I was on regional chairs. So we're about to go out to Anne on chairs. So they will support the RDs, the 7 RDs in each of the regions, network with all the chairs in the patch, be involved in chair appraisals and have a line relationship to Penny. And hopefully they will just add some capacity in that particular level of the system, which I think is much needed. Thank you.
And quick question, Andrew. How do we ensure, given that we are placing a lot, as we all come through everything, on our trust boards and our wider governance systems, our ICB boards, and so on, how do we make sure that we really have the calibre of chairs and non-execs that we are looking for? Because you were talking about going broad, the risk is that then we don't have people who can really interrogate the data and the.
So I think it's about creating a development program when people are in post, buddying with others going forward. It's trying to get people with lots of experience of dealing with managing a board or working at board level. And these things you learn on the job. We're not historically, the NHS has not been particularly good at developing those skills. And I think going forward, it's something that we should be doing. And I know Jim is keen on this. Around how do we develop our top leaders. And a trust has a key partnership, in my opinion. It's the chair and it's the chief exec. When they work well together, the whole board tends to work really, really well. If you've got some dissonance, then you've got tension. But working out that relationship, if you're a chief exec or a chair, is really, really important. And some people do it really, really well. Some do it less well. And we want to make sure that everyone does it, fantastically well, for obvious reasons. So I think, we should be, pushing harder at a development programme for each of those groups of individuals.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, Sam.
I suppose my question, Andrew, is how do we get clinical leadership engagement at that sort of level, and have we got the balance right? Are there enough clinicians on the board? Because the decisions they make every day often have very big impact on finances, on the system, and on population health.
So I think, again, if you look internationally, generally speaking, there are more clinicians in leadership positions than we have in the England NHS. And I think the success of a good board is having a very, very strong clinical voice. And sitting below that, having some sort of representation where people feel in a specialty that they have a voice. And they can express their opinion, have an input on key decisions that a board makes. I think clinicians, over time, the relationships between the kind of board level and the clinicians has fractured a little in some organisations, if I may say, and we need to kind of win that back if we're to do some of the reforms that we intend to roll out and make the service far more kind of consumer orientated. So I think there's a big challenge for us around getting the right people in the right place and getting clinicians in leadership positions. There are relatively few chief execs in England who've got a clinical background, and actually, you know, it should be more. It should be more, because it is, being a chief exec is a fantastic job, in my humble opinion, and you can, you know, make significant change to the services, the health of your local community, and we should give clinicians a lot more opportunity to contribute.
Robert?
So in the terms of reference, you say the focus is going to be on the internal workforce of the NHS, which makes sense. But my question is, does that include the 10-year workforce plan, which is a crucial delivery part of the 10-year plan? And if it isn't addressed in this committee, where is it being sort of overseen?
It's in the strategy committee.
Yeah.
Strategy committee.
Our focus is...
We've got a time slot for it as well.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Our focus is predominantly NHS England.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you for that and for standing in for Louise. And I think we will come back in the new year to doing more about that board development work. I'm interested in that. So, Mark.
Committee. So one sort of general overview point and two specific ones. So real conclusion from digital maturity assessments that the more digitally mature operations are, the more productive they are. And we saw most of the papers that then fell under that area were in the theme of how do we take strategic intent and accelerate it into action and actual deployment. So one discussion around how do we have very clear, robust processes around AI adoption that then allows us to roll out ambient voice, which clearly has very big frontline benefit. How we work much more closely with the other directorates, so neighbourhood, primary care, UEC, about what triage really means. And that was a recurring theme in the importance of modern service frameworks, which again, fully digitised, we think there are big productivity benefits out there to be had. In terms of two specific discussions, we had a deep dive on the federated data platform. When it's deployed with 6 or 7 core components, it is having a clear benefit on interoperability within the trusts and the overall productivity of those trusts. And I think the real question is, how do we accelerate that rollout and accelerate adoption? And then we had a deep dive into the first element of the medium-term planning, digital triage in the app, what that really means, what actions and decisions have to be made for it to be practically implementable, as opposed to just an idea. So good progress, still a lot to do.
Okay, and on that FDP times 6 to 7 components, how many trusts is that active in now? Or you can ask a friend.
Ask a friend, Jules.
Okay. But what's, I mean, like 10%, 50%?
I have to check very quickly on 6 it's deployed to. Check.
Okay.
Yeah. It is so if you look at the majority of deployments do not have the full suite. Where the full suite is in place, it is very effective.
Okay, great.
And there are often used examples where we've seen it and it's been embedded for a while.
Okay. Elizabeth?
Thank you. We're doing quite a bit at the moment on the should-be costs, as we're describing it, and how do we embed digital in a number of the pathways. We're obviously doing that at an executive level. It'd be good to come to the committee maybe and share, and for you to test some of what we're doing, if that's an opportunity, Mark.
Great.
Please.
Ravi?
On the electronic patient record, it says that 95% of trusts have implemented it. Are we seeing that translate into clinical decision-making and their behaviour?
I think this is a prime example of the difference between strategy and deployment and operational experience. Anecdotally, and I've asked for the data on it, some deployments of EPRs lead to a 5-year dip in productivity. And it's because of embedding with actual clinical pathways and training our colleagues to actually use the systems effectively. So when done well, they are a definite force for good. The 95% does not reflect where done well.
I guess it was a reflection on the comments around AI and the adoption of AI, and clear guidance is just to reflect. I think there's something really important about the professional regulators keeping pace with that, and certainly something that we have raised, or I've raised with the Nursing Midwifery Council. There's a review of the code of conduct going on at the moment. I think it's an important part of making sure that these keep pace, and I'm sure Aidan's got reflections on the medical side of things.
Yeah, I think there's quite, well, as we've sort of neatly shown, there's clearly interfaces between the clinical work, the care pathways and the technology, and we've got to keep coming back to bringing all that together. Okay, good. So, hand over to you, Jim.
Yeah, thanks, Penny. So I'm going to just do a bit of a general update first on things that have happened since last board, but then spend a bit more time talking about where we are with regard to winter, just to tee up Sarah Jane a little bit, but also industrial action. So we'll start and end with industrial action. First of all, a thanks for everybody here, but especially out in the service, for how the last round was managed, building on progress in the experience in the summer. Really, really fantastically managed. I think it's extremely sad that we're talking about getting very good at something none of us want to do. So sort of sad reflection of where we are now, but the service did an incredible job. And on management information, obviously, to go through all the QA, a very, very strong month electively, oddly, in a month of industrial action. Mark will share that when the data's been through all the QA processes, etc. Just going back to general updates, so there's an awful lot happened. Every time we have one of these sessions, I think in reality we're on dog years, so it's 3 months feels like 2 years or so. We've had medium-term planning frameworks issued after a very long, complicated discussion with government about allocations and how all that works, etc. Again, allocations out for 2 years, real development on neighbourhoods, the Advanced Foundation Trust pipeline, progress on IHOs, etc. When you stand back from that and you see what the NHS actually coping with, as well as day-to-day operational pressures, and I think real evidence that people are starting to think of the future as well as today as well, which is what that medium-term planning thing's about, I think is absolutely incredibly impressive. But as always, still a lot to do. We've still got to land this year. We've got to get through winter. We've got to, get decent plans in for 3 years that deliver what we need to do. But I think we should again acknowledge progress and how big a leap that has been for the service, and also, as Elizabeth will cover later on, being broadly on plan at this point in the year is really impressive again, compared to previous rounds. Andrew's already mentioned as well, as part of that discussion with government, we've got agreement to progress on the voluntary redundancy scheme, so that's now progressing actively here and out in ICBs. So very frustrating. We've all recorded before how unhappy and disappointed would be in the way that had been handled because of the delay, but at least now people are able to progress, and that's a live conversation here and out in the service. So it'd be good to get that concluded as quickly and as effectively as we can. It feels like winter though, doesn't it? So we're looking out the windows there and it's dark. It was nearly freezing when I left home this morning. It is proper winter, and we've had a really, really big increase in flu over the last few weeks. We're at that point where there's lots of sources of data. It takes a long time for the data to sort of feed through and become more valid, more technically sound, etc. But if you just stand back and look from the way the data is moving day by day, we are currently at around 2,000 occupied beds. I would think it's reasonable to assume we'll be between 5,000 and 8,000 occupied beds around this time next week. That's a material impact on our capacity as we're recovering from the last round of industrial action and just about sadly head into another one. On Monday, we'd set up a call with Chief Exec colleagues to just talk through that rise in flu and the operational pressures that were evident as a result of that. And just as we started the call, I got the message to say that industrial action was going to be called again. And I think, to be fair, there's a genuine and palpable feeling of anger, frustration, exasperation. Lots of discussions since. I was talking to a Chief Exec colleague on the way down, spoke to some consultant colleagues a few days ago. I think we're all just really trying to get our heads around something that feels cruel, feels calculated to cause mayhem, create harm, at a time when the service is really pulling all the stops out to try and avoid that and keep people safe. So I really do hope we can find a way of avoiding this. We can't expect this round to be similar to the last two, because it's now being cold at the height of winter, when we've got a lot of flu around, and we are actively considering what our national response to that should be. And also with colleagues out in the service, we'll talk to them on Monday again to work through what's most helpful to them to keep patients safe. So you sit back from all of that, absolutely unbelievable progress in a very, very hard year, progress on multiple fronts. Still a lot to do. It's always it's always difficult at this point of year as people start thinking about Christmas and time with our families. Sadly, a lot of people won't have that this year because of industrial action. They'll be having to work to keep the show on the road. And genuine signs of optimism as well on that progress and the ability to plan ahead. But again, tarnished with the call for industrial action. And I just want to I was going to quote a load of stats, but I'm just going to dwell on one, if you can bear with me for a minute. So one of our very large organisations, UHB in Birmingham, has been really challenged in lots of ways over the years. And you look at what they've achieved electively this year, it's absolutely unbelievable. So a nearly 15% increase in RTT performance, improvement in RTT performance in a year, and a reduction of 45,000 on 143,000 in list size in a similar period. So when people are saying to us this isn't possible, it's possible because it's happened. It is happening. Neighbourhoods are happening. IHOs are developing, etc. So when we're handling ourselves and managing our grumpiness through industrial action and various other things, I think we need to go back to those sorts of things, and that is the stuff that gives us hope. So I'll stop there and take any questions, Penny.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you for leading us at this time. So, questions for Jim? Take Sam. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm always slightly nervous about mentioning general practice because I'm a GP, but actually it's been a great success, I think, the total triage. Massive increased use in online requests for consultations. There are some problems and stresses that we clearly need to deal with, but it is the one part of the NHS, patient satisfaction is going up, productivity is up. It's a really good news story. But also I think we need to acknowledge all the hard work people are doing in primary care and recognise some of the stresses, like issues around continuity of care, that need to be addressed. So it'd be great to get your thoughts on that. And then the much more wider issue, we sort of touched on it with Andrew, with the board, is how we engage all the clinicians in the circumstances actually of some of these industrial actions in transforming the NHS.
Yeah. Absolutely. So I couldn't agree more on the primary care thing, Sam. And I mean, if we're honest, when we look at those experience stats, I'm still a bit conditioned to look at them and expect bad news. The last few have been really fantastic news, haven't they, Amanda? It's really powerful, demonstrable, robust data that shows that people are actually happy with what's being done. But that is at the expense of a lot of hard work, colleagues in primary care. Primary care has also really stepped up, I think, on the neighbourhood conversation, and they are actively involved and driving those discussions. Whether people have noticed or not, our conversations have shifted more into that territory and slightly away from the normal kind of hospital stuff. So I think real acknowledgement. But all of these things, and Glenn and I talk about this a bit, when we're talking about neighbourhoods, IHOs, the shift to community, generally, it is reliant on leadership capacity, but not traditional leadership in every regard, especially the clinical leadership, including our nursing colleagues and HPs and others. And we've started a conversation this week about how we start, when we talked last time about leadership and management standards, about how we broaden that out to cover leadership in the round, so we can have a conversation in the new year that addresses all of the issues you've described, but also make sure in our troubled places we can actually recruit chief executives, finance directors, nurse directors, etc., and start building a pipeline for the future as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Andrew?
So Jim, I think we've seen a lot of boards step up to the plate this year and really deliver. But I know a lot of boards are still trying to square off, do I deliver the money or some of the targets? And if I can't deliver the money, what happens to the targets? And I don't know what advice you give these entities when they're faced with that situation about how do you trade off some of these things. I mean, you talked about UHB, and that performance on electives has been fantastic, but the organisation is quite challenged on the ED front on 4 hours. So it's just squaring it off, and I think a lot of boards are trying to make the right call this year. And it's quite a difficult challenge if you're on the edge financially and you've got a difficult winter, and ideally you've got a bit more capacity that you could open, but you haven't got the money to do so. Yeah. And it's sorting out those trade-offs that I think is really, really important, and making the right call, because what we don't want to see is boards making the wrong call and failing on everything. Yeah. That would be disastrous.
So I'll come back, Elizabeth, with other colleagues chip in as well. Really, really pertinent, Andrew. And first thing I would say is there's a risk in all this, in an era when we're trying to devolve, that would take the keys back off people. So when they're juggling with these things, we get too far into their decision making. We need to build boards so they help build boards so they have these conversations locally and make those choices. Myself and other colleagues are regularly in conversation with people out there who are juggling this and trying to give advice in the best way, provide support in the best way, because I think it is important that the boards locally with clinical colleagues have the conversation about what's reasonable and what's possible, and also take people back to the plans. These boards have assured themselves of plans earlier on in the year. And again, an earlier conversation this week with the Chief Exec was going through exactly that challenge in ED. Some leadership challenges with the clinical leadership in that organisation. Thought it was wise to have a proper warts and all board conversation. I agreed with them, and they're going to facilitate that now. But also, I think if we're honest, try not to get caught too much up in the it's either this or that, because that's the problem we've had in recent years. We can't have this or that. We've actually got to try and deliver across the whole range as best we can.
Okay, so we've got Glenn wants to come in and then Elizabeth, but just before that I might just add a bit of a question myself to it. So we have produced a lot of data and analysis here at the centre, whether it's for ICBs through the model system work, or whether it's through trusts through the model hospital work and the different benchmarking packs and so on. So there is a lot of data out there to help inform trusts on where there are opportunities to improve their performance and so on. Recognise, it's only one piece of crunching data, so it's not necessarily the gospel, but it's got some really great information in there. To what degree are trusts and ICBs using that to identify sort of almost the answer to your question, Andrew, where should they be focusing and where should they be going? So I don't know whether, Glenn, you want to come in on that, or Elizabeth? But
could maybe add that to what I was going to say. I mean, the 4 boards in the foundation group, we went through all of that data when we last met, and it highlights always opportunities for improvement, no matter how well you're doing on some of those things. Andrew, you mentioned the Chief Exec job being a great job. One of the reasons why it's a great job is because it's quite challenging, but then really rewarding when you can bring that all together to work for patients. The UHB one is a really good example. Listen to their Chief Executive talk at the West Midlands Chief Execs Forum a couple of weeks ago about what they've done, and what they've done there is they re-engineered a lot of their pathways, and they've innovated. So it's not just about working harder to deliver improved waiting times, they work more efficiently to do it. So they're a really good example of what you can do using that kind of data.
Yeah, very good, thanks. That'd be good to perhaps try and capture that a bit more and share it. Elizabeth?
I'd just echo a point, so I won't labour it. In respect of the productivity data in particular, the amount of engagement, and I think I've mentioned before, curiosity from boards, not just execs, has been huge. We've been out and about to all regions now doing various sessions. I think, David, you mentioned some of the slide packs and how it's provoking a different type of conversation, because it can't just be work harder. It's got to be, and that's where I think the excitement from facing into the 10-year plan is health plan is coming, because it's got to be about, you know, how do we reform our way out of the problem. Also, it's hard to answer the question, because it's hard to answer the question in a universal way, because what I've experienced is people that come to me with the challenges you've described, their issues are so local, but we are helping them work their way through it. But just the True Up exercise has told us a lot about how we're going to improve planning this year, because we have got boards across the country that don't seem to have activity plans that are triangulated. Well, people think they're commissioning, and then when you're trying to have, you know, sensible conversations to really help, that information isn't there. So there's a lot of work that's gone on through the summer just to make sure that we're not in this predicament next year.
Okay. Good. Rob?
Thank you, Chair. It's just worth pointing out that in terms of all the good things we're hearing about UHB, it's actually been their clinical leadership that has helped to drive the neighbourhood development in the east of Birmingham. I was a key part of that the last few years. We simply couldn't have done it without them heavily leaning in, both with the GP, social care, voluntary sector community, but their presence was absolutely important. So it's an example where we can both deliver future change and deliver the stuff we need to do today.
Good. Good focus on Birmingham today. So, Sarah Jane Winter.
With the Black Country accent.
Exactly.
Not the Birmingham one, sorry to disappoint. Okay, thank you, and obviously building on the context that Jim has set out. So I'll just walk us through the highlights of the paper, but assume you'll want to focus the time on the discussion, Penny. So we're going into this winter in a challenging context operationally. I think the main measure that we always look at across the ops teams, not just in NHS England but in the NHS, is the bed occupancy, because the bed occupancy really drives our ability to be able to maintain system flow, and bed occupancy has been challenged throughout the year. I would though say that on the resilience front, we are going into this winter with a more resilient ambulance service than we have previously. We've done some really good work on ambulance productivity, different ways of working, routing into community services and so on, and our ambulances are routinely now running around 10 minutes ahead of where they were previously. So that is people with heart attack, strokes getting collected and taken to hospital 10 minutes earlier. So real challenges in the hospital sector as we approach winter. Slightly more resilient ambulance service. I know it'll still come under pressure. So the strategy this year's had three phases to it. First of all, preparation. So in terms of preparation, both ICBs and trusts have collectively worked, including with colleagues from primary care, social care, on what their winter plans are. We've tested them against 3 different scenario pressure levels so that everybody's really clear who needs to do what when. What we might want to do in terms of sort of alternatives to admission, conveyance and so on, when capacity needs to open, importantly how IPC needs to work at the front door, the importance of vaccination rates both in the population but also for our clinical teams and wider staff groups. We tested those plans formally in September. I reported that back to the board. There were some gaps identified in both trust and ICB level, but through the regions we worked hard with those organisations to close the gaps as best we could, but we still knew as winter approached that we would have some challenges. We then moved into what we've described as staying ahead. So always when you're under operational pressure, we don't want to hit the stage where some of the things that are absolutely safety critical really struggle to be able to function. So the staying ahead strategy is really about having a very close focus now on discharge and bed occupancy, not letting too much pressure build up at the front door, not ending up in a situation where we've got too many people in corridors, which means we can't get people off back of ambulances, and I'll come back to corridors in a moment. And then when we really get up against it, it is that operational response. I think every winter, forever in the NHS, there's been a 2 to 3 week period where it is really, really pressurised, and it's about how we all work together up and down the system, and it is 24/7 to make sure that we take the decisions to spread the clinical risk, so that in an attempt to not work collectively as a system, we don't end up shifting the risk onto patients, which is what we need to avoid at all costs. So as we go into this more challenging period now, our 3 main priorities will be to be able to maintain the Category 2 ambulance response. We cannot leave people at home unattended that need an ambulance. To do that, we need to maintain hospital handover at the front door, and to do that, we will end up with some of our A&E departments overcrowded and some patients in corridors, which we know is unacceptable. But I think the clinicians who lead the discussions are very clear that the most significant risk of all is to not respond with an ambulance to someone who needs one. So that always will have to be our strategic priority. In terms of the corridor care then, it is an horrendous consequence of the situation that we find ourselves in, and we know for individual patients this is horrendous. We're working really closely with NHS England through the regional teams with some of the organisations that have got the biggest challenges. Again, to return to the conversation we had before, there are some things that organisations can do that are within their own gift to help to resolve it. Some of them are wider system things that will be driven by neighbourhood health and community response and so on. We do now have a team led by Professor Tim Briggs through GIRFT that is working more closely with the organisations that have got the really big challenges to see what more we can do, particularly over the next few weeks, to be able to resolve that. But some of these are long-standing issues, and we know hospitals will be under pressure, and we're exceptionally grateful to the clinicians that are working in these circumstances to maintain safety. Finally, Penny, I just want to say a few words now about the interface with industrial action and why we in the operational team are more concerned about this period of industrial action than we have been about previous ones, given we've led each of the periods that we've unfortunately had over the last few years. So the industrial action falls in a challenging time for us in the run-up to Christmas, when we've got the high bed occupancy, the rising levels of flu and so on. We will be able to maintain through the period because we'll use our consultant colleagues to cover the shifts that are left vacant by striking doctors. But when the period of industrial action finishes, we've only then got 2 short days before we go into 4 days of bank holiday and weekend working. And when we emerge from that, we're then in the most challenging week that the NHS faces every year, because that always happens between Christmas and New Year. So we can't think about this as a 5-day strike period from a resilience perspective. We have to think about it over that 2 to 3 week period. And it is the same people that are that we would normally call on to do the extra shifts in the gaps between Christmas and New Year that will have worked to have covered the strikes. We also know that we get a bit of an issue in the way that our discharge processes work. A lot of them get brought forward during industrial action, which means that bed occupancy can rise quite steeply afterwards. So I think we're going into this one really quite concerned about our ability, not necessarily to manage through it, but to manage post it. And I think that's why Jim referenced at the end of his opening that we need to think if there's anything more we can do as NHS England to support our frontline leaders who are doing everything they can to think through how they manage this. I met a group of 20 this week, lots of concern, the most concern I've seen, but we will work together to do the best we can over the period for patients. Thank you.
Yeah, just to add to that, there's a really tricky balance here where we have to recognise the amount of risk out there, and there certainly are pockets of the country that are in an enhanced state of escalation, clinical incidents, etc., and that will get worse over the next few weeks. So in lots of ways, it will feel like the COVID period, and the kind of pressure that people are facing. So we need to be able to do things that help. But the feedback Sarah Jane's had this week, which I thought was really helpful, and it's helpful to have the conversation, isn't it? Is about if that help is we just have lots of calls with people who are actually trying to manage risk in their organisation. That's not helpful. So we just got to get that balance right in the next couple of weeks about genuinely what can we do to introduce support, better decisions, different risk thresholds to reflect the circumstances, but not add to the burden of people out there on the front line. It's quite a hard balance.
Yeah, and just on that, then we come back to wider things. I mean, are there other things that we should be considering in the same way that we did in COVID? So, for example, flexing some of our staffing models, looking at greater use of technology.
Absolutely. All that's in the mix, Penny. So we are dusting all of that off again and think about what more can we do, what more can we do about discharge, for example, to reduce occupancy as we go into this as well. And that will require us all to work together on risk thresholds and stay together, because not all of it will work. But the what we can't do is just watch it happen.
Yeah, okay. So I've got a couple of questions. I know Sam wants to come in. Maybe we'll take a few together, Andrew. So mine were two, and I'm linking then to the performance report. So the performance report, page 21, would suggest that we're not doing very well on discharge. And I worry about that because our length of stay is a bit of an outlier globally, the fact that it's going up. And we know it's gone up since pre-COVID and so on. And we do hear quite different things. You know, partly we could sort this by improving processes within our organisations. Partly this is about improving capacity outside of hospital, but then you speak to the suppliers of that capacity outside of hospital and they say that they've got the capacity there, that we're not using it. So it'd be quite good to have a bit more on discharge. And then also on the performance report, we did say we were going to look at rates of admission to hospital, and I can't see that in there. So I think if we could get that in, because we do have this very big variation in terms of the same conditions, who ends up being admitted to hospital and who doesn't in different parts of the country, and something we're spending a lot of time on in the neighbourhood work, but we need to look at it through this lens as well. Sam?
Yeah, mine's on what more we can do for flu vaccination. The latest figures I saw, we've done better than last year, but having the levels of flu that we've got at the moment, which is intensely high, is also an opportunity actually to get people vaccinated. And also focus, dare I say, if you're hoping for a possibility of herd immunity, which is always a struggle, focusing on those ones not eligible under the NHS. In my area, you can get it for £10. That's probably one of the best investments anyone could do in terms of preventing what can be a pretty horrible illness, even for somebody who's healthy.
Andrew?
So I thought the piece this morning on Radio 4 was quite good around inappropriate attenders in an ED setting. I'm just wondering whether we could kind of step that up, and also just picking up the issue around same-day attenders, urgent attenders for GP practices. There's no data in the pack on that, but I believe that the position has improved. Yeah. And I don't know whether there's any, further potential to maximise that a little bit more. So as we go into the strike period, we blitz the kind of local communities around. Only go to ED. If you've got X, Y, and Z, please go, elsewhere. If you use 111 or your local GP practice as an alternative. And okay, it's not going to affect the patients potentially you admit, but it will help clear the ED down in terms of congestion.
Yeah, Rob.
Thank you, Chair. Just on that point, we held a nationwide session with the comms leads out in trusts and providers, ICBs, etc. yesterday. There's a real energy for all of that that's been generated locally because there are slightly different solutions in each patch. You're seeing a lot of people wanting to lean in. It's not just leaving this to the acute communications teams to deal with the problem that's in front of them. It's mental health community, ICB colleagues really emphasising the options that are there for you. I think nationally we've done a 24 hours not in A&E set of materials that I think is going to help locally as well. But it's very much locally driven. What options are available, but you got a real sense yesterday that the whole system's wanting to lean in to help ensure they're doing everything they can, that patients and communities are aware of all the choices that are available to them.
Okay, so piece on discharge. Oh, sorry, Mark. Yeah.
On that inappropriate attendance, what sort of scale of people are in UEC who are either not treated or should have been treated somewhere else?
I can start there and work back. So we've got an acuity tool. It's not completely rolled out and deployed, but it's something that the clinical team worked on, and we did work with a lot of organisations to implement this tool, which basically at the point of attendance, there's a triage that takes place that puts people in acuity categories 1 to 5, with the sort of underlying model that the patients that are in acuity group 4 and 5 could have been treated elsewhere, and about 40% of patients that attend would be suitable to be treated in an alternative setting. Now that alternative...
4 in 10?
Yes, but that alternative setting obviously needs to be there and be open for it to happen. So it's not, it would give somebody an acuity score of 4 and say they're suitable for a UTC, but it might be 10 o'clock at night and the UTC might not be open. But in terms of patients that truly need to be in an emergency department, that is about the scale of the opportunity, but the community services would need to look different. There is then a group of that 60% that remain that actually could be fast-tracked really quite quickly and are in many organisations to a same-day emergency care or a frailty type of facility, which means that true emergency department patients are probably less than half of those that are currently in many people's departments. But like I say, it's not as simple as those ones shouldn't be there, because those people need something else and it's not always there. But we're pretty
luckily we've got a 10-year plan that says that we're going to tackle.
In the context of a massive spike in flu that clearly isn't in the general discourse in society today, and I'll be polite, the unfortunate timing of industrial action, Rob, is there a way that level of where the scale of issue that we're almost can be shared with the population as a whole? Because
so we're going to pick this up, Mark, as the whole. What can we do in the run into this round of industrial action, but also generally around winter? Just to pick up on Sarah Jane's point, and this will sound ridiculous, but on days where there's a big football match, for example, A&E footfall massively drops. There are other times of the year where footfall massively drops. There's loads of ways of looking at this data, but if you look at ambulance deliveries, most people would think if you're in an ambulance, you're almost certainly going to be admitted. It's about 40% of that volume isn't admitted as well. So there is a lot, there's no question there's a lot for us to go at. It's just really hard to do while you've got lots of other things going on. But I think we've taken the challenge, we're giving ourselves the challenge about what more can we do in this next week then with these things to give ourselves a better chance.
But, well, crucially, we also have to get to next winter not in this situation again. It's been the same conversation for many people around this table for many, many years. And we know that we can and we need to redesign the model of care so that those alternatives are there.
And then just to add in the productivity packs that you've talked about, Penny, we've got some estimates, they're not high estimates, reasonable, that suggest we spend about £500 million on A&E attendances with no significant treatment, so investigations, and we are working out what that looks like per provider.
Lots of opportunity. Now, I'm losing control of the room slightly. We've got, I think we won't be able to take a second round of questions on this because we do need to keep going. We can come back to things later. So, discharge and then on flu uptake.
Yeah, so on discharge, I think this is probably our number one area of concern because it's the number one area of opportunity. So I think the way we think about it is 3 blocks. What hospitals themselves can absolutely do through process engineering and improvement. We have seen a small improvement in delays that relate to hospital processes over the last year. So organisations, there are still delays that relate, but they are coming down as a proportion of the total delays, and we'll continue to drive that through the productivity packs, the GIRF team, etc. There's then a big group, and I think this is why you're hearing what you're hearing, Penny, where the delay relates to the decision making about the process of moving out of hospital into the domiciliary care package or the nursing home, etc. And a lot of that delay actually relates to the social care, the social worker capacity, and the trusted assessor model. Actually, once patients are assessed, they can move into the capacity, but we've got a delay there. Now, where that's working well, there's discharge to assess models, there's trusted assessor. In places where it's not, we can see a delay sometimes of 4 or 5 days for that assessment to take place. I think that's why you hear the disconnect between the NHS saying we don't have enough social care capacity and social care saying, but we do have the capacity, we're just not getting the referrals through to us for the patients. So we've got pieces of work going on both of those, but I think that area in the middle, particularly the interface between the NHS's own services, the hospital and community, and then the community and social care is the one where we've got a lot of opportunity to go at moving forwards. In the here and now in winter, we will focus on the hospital ones on the basis that we know the levers, we know the things that work, we've got a team that's able to help and support, so that's where we are now, but there's a lot more to go at. I would say that some of our length of stay sort of stabilisation is also being driven by a lot of patients going through SDEC pathways now. And we must continue to do that. There's a hell of a lot more opportunity there. And then finally on vaccination, the channels are all open. I think the Flu Finder service, there's a lot more convenient locations that people can go to at different times, all those things. I just think we've seen a bit of a drying up of, the people who really wanted it initially have gone for it, and there's been a lot of campaigns locally and nationally to try and push more people through. I do think it would be helpful here, Chair, if we could give the really clear message about the effectiveness of this vaccine. So I think there's been some things circulating that because of the different strains of flu, maybe it's not as effective. But our colleagues in UK HSA are really clear that makes it more important to get the vaccine. It does prevent severe illness and hospital admission, and nobody should be taking a choice not to get it because they think it won't be effective. It's more important than ever because of the way it's circulating and the protection it provides to get it. So we continue to give out that message. And yet, hopefully we'll get more people to come forward over the next few weeks, including our own staff, because what we can't have is people going off sick in the areas of where we're really concerned at the same time as we've got this increased need.
Okay, good. So I'm going to move us on to the next item, but key things. Rob, to work with HSA, it should be a massive up. In COVID, people rushed to get to the vaccine, not everybody. We want people to rush to get this vaccine. So we've got to up the ante on that. And then we will keep coming back to the numbers. 40% of people in A&Es didn't need to be there. We have got the numbers, and it's around probably up to 60% of emergency admissions may not have been the most appropriate place. And that 1 day excess length of stay, 1 day average per admission length of stay, or 0.9 excess length of stay is massive. So I think 3 numbers, we keep coming back to 3 numbers. Are they going in the right direction, and what do we want them to look like for next year and the year after?
Yeah.
Come back to that. Okay, so risk, John?
Thank you. Yeah, so we're presenting our summaries of the strategic and operational risk registers here, and I'd just like to draw out 3 points, if I may. So the quality of care risk has decreased in score slightly since the last time we brought this to the board, and that reflects the mitigations that are complete and progressing around developing the National Quality Board, the integration of quality and safety considerations into the model ICB and the model region work, and the work we've been doing within the organisation to look at quality governance structures as well. The second point is, if you look at the first annex that summarises our top risks, you'll see that each of those is now mapped to a board committee and has a date diarised now for a deep dive in the coming year. So the purpose of that is for each of those committees to be able to get into the detail that we don't have time to hear on causes, impacts, mitigating actions, and what the trajectory looks like to hopefully bring that risk score down. So we'll be asking executives and chairs of those committees to prioritise those in the coming months and year. And then the third point is we're continuing to work closely with colleagues at the department on risk management. We've got a joint session of our audit committees next week where we're going to be talking about our ambition for that and how we're going to get there. But what we'd like to be able to do is to bring together our risk registers, or at least the common risks within them, so that it looks and feels the same for those responsible for mitigating those risks in our joint executive teams. We know that some risks will continue to be specific to each organisation while they still exist as separate entities, but where that's not the case, we want to avoid duplication and things going through 2 separate structures and feeling overly onerous. So that's our job in the coming months. I'll pause there.
Any questions? Okay, I've got one. Why is our target score 20 deep red in 3 areas? Why aren't we more sort of aspirational?
So I think risk owners will have to answer that question on an individual basis, but in broad strokes, the nature of a lot of these top risks is such that it's not all within our control, and in some cases a lot of it is not within our control, and I think that reflects the level that we feel that we can take it to through actions within NHS England. So I'm happy to take that away with individual risk owners and push a bit further, but I think that's where we've been historically, is that it can feel difficult to own all the actions that we know are needed across the whole system and wider to bring these down to a more manageable level.
I think that would be a good thing to come back to say what would it take in order to get them to a amber. Okay, good. Right, let's come on to the wider performance and delivery report. David.
Thank you, Chair. So, report presented as usual. Just to say, it's broken up into the 6 domains. We've reflected a lot on the feedback from board last time, and hopefully colleagues will see the changes that have been made, with particular reference to domain 1 around health and reducing inequalities. We've also dived a lot deeper into organisational and ICB performance against many of these metrics. So if it's okay, Chair, what I'll do is just briefly summarise the improved areas of performance, the challenged areas of performance, and then just touch on the key operational areas. My colleagues around the table, of course, are the experts in this field, but delighted to take questions on any of the points raised. So firstly, just in terms of improved performance, some good areas of performance, some of which are marginal, but it's important to recognise the success in a number of areas. Firstly, around the number of adult inpatients who are autistic or have a learning disability has continued to reduce, which is a good result as an area of significant focus. The percentage of patients conveyed to emergency departments by ambulance, the point that Sarah Jane was picking up earlier. The percentage of patients with the general practice with recorded CVD and their cholesterol's being managed continues to improve. Care patients referred to crisis team management, again within 24 hours, continues to improve. The use of antibiotics or the prescription of it in children between 0 and 9 continues to reduce. And we touched on this earlier in the conversation, that percentage of patients who received perceived ease of contacting GPs, it's the highest since this survey has ever begun. And you will see now that online contact is now perceived as the easiest contact method, overtaking in person just marginally, but it's the first time we've seen the dial shift. Children and young people accessing funded mental health services continues to improve, and that's been an area of significant focus, as has community mental health access rates, something we've been performance managing our regions very hard on to understand the areas of progress. And finally, of course, I won't touch on the finance and steal Elizabeth's thunder afterwards, but that remains an area of improved position. So if that was a summary of where things are improving, we of course have a number of areas where we continue to remain challenged and we're working hard. The first, continuing around the issue of health inequalities, our cervical screening coverage is slightly lower than we would have hoped for and where we have seen previously, as is MMR update, particularly for the second dose for 5-year-olds, which I know is an area of focus. The percentage of patients treated within cancer within 62 days of referral is slightly below target, and you'll see in the pack the detail of organisations and ICB performance in this area. And the percentage of patients waiting over 52 weeks for community services, again, is slightly lower than we would wish to see it at compared to previous months. Our 4-hour performance, Sarah Jane, I know, has picked up, but we are marginally behind where we wish to be, but an improved position on previous years. And 12-hour performance, we've continued to see a deterioration in our performance. We're working hard, and I'll come on to talk about mental health further on today, but the percentage of patients with suspected autism are continuing to wait longer than we wish, and over 13 weeks, but that is an area of significant focus. Just finally, the key operational areas of performance. Again, some of these are marginal, but again, it's important to celebrate some of the real success, and Jim has picked up on a number of these already. As noted in the news, our emergency departments continue to remain busier than ever. Demand on our services for ED has risen by over 1,000 a day from the same month in the previous year, just to put it into perspective. In October 2025, which is where we're working to at the moment, about 74.1% of our patients were treated within the 4 hours that we picked up earlier. And we've seen some challenges around the ambulance CAT 2 times, which Sarah Jane was referencing earlier. In terms of our overall waiting list, as Jim said, we are waiting for final stats, but if we look at the end of September, it's pleasing to see that there was an improvement in our overall waiting list, back down to 7.39 million people waiting, so that's a decrease of nearly 16,000, and nearly 62% of patients waiting less than 18 weeks, against our end of March ambition next year of 65%. Two final statistics, if I may. The first is that as of September we had 286,000 people being seen for urgent suspected cancer referral. So just to put that in perspective, there's about 13,500 patients every day now being seen for urgent suspected cancer, and a lot of those pathways radically improved from where they were previously. And very finally, performance against the 28-day for faster diagnostics is at around 74%, so not too far away from the constitutional standard that we wish to achieve. Very happy to take comments on anything in the pack, and as I say, the experts are also around the table, Penny.
Great. So, I've got a few while everyone's thinking.
Get my pen out.
Two, first is comment, well, they're both comments really. So on the first one, I'm pretty sure, but I may have got this wrong, that we said we would separate out effectiveness from experience. I don't think we can put the two together. They're completely different. They're different focuses, and I think if Louise was here, she would want us to see a dedicated section on patient user experience.
Okay.
And I think that's true for the NOF as well, which I know we'll talk about later. And then effectiveness, I'd say the same. So that's the first one. The second is you didn't talk about diabetes and the things not going so well. And we've got this group, diabetes and cardiovascular disease, where, yeah, there's a bit of improvement, but they're really, the diabetes one is going backwards. Yeah. And I think considering, that cardiovascular diabetes remains our biggest killer, these, to be at such low absolute numbers and deteriorating numbers, particularly for that diabetes care and for some aspects of the cardiovascular disease, is not good. Yep. So what's our big focus plan of work on that?
Well, just if I bring other colleagues in on diabetes and CVD, potentially Amanda to answer that. But one thing we will discuss later is the opportunity, obviously, to deep dive in a number of key areas. We've talked about maternity. I wonder whether CVD and diabetes more generally might be a deep dive area.
Yeah.
Amanda,
yeah.
Just on the diabetes, it's measured, as you know, through QOF, so it's an annual measure for this current year, so 25-26. We shifted incentives in QOF to have a much, much greater focus on the things that contribute towards secondary prevention of cardiovascular mortality, and that includes a greater focus on the diabetes and CVD indicators. We don't yet have the data to see whether that has been effective. But I would suggest that what this measure does is looks at the proportion of people who had all of the interventions relating to good diabetes care. We really need to break that down by individual interventions and look at where the problems actually are, because I suspect it's not just a general flat.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. And if we could also do that without exceptions, with exceptions and without exceptions, that would be very helpful.
We do measure exceptions across.
Yeah, so if we can see the data there in this, with and without, that would be.
Yeah.
Okay, so I've got Matt and Robert and Ravi. Okay. Oh, no, you're okay. Robert?
Yeah, so under the improving health and reducing inequality section, there's a slide 8 is... it's shocking, I think, that in this day and age we're seeing a decrease in healthy life expectancy post-pandemic. So, I mean, the comment is, much of this is out with the NHS in a sense, but the emphasis in the 10-year plan to shift towards prevention just illustrates how crucially important that is. The question is international comparisons, because my understanding actually is that a number of EU countries saw an improvement, arguably because some of the most vulnerable were lost during COVID. But do you know how much of an outlier we are?
Ravi was next, and then Sam. Ravi. Yeah.
Just on 4-hour performance and 12-hour performance, do we really understand what's driving the slight monthly decline, and when do you think we will get onto a trajectory where we're actually going to start meeting the target? And the second thing, just on vaccines, I just wondered, in terms of the variation geographically on vaccine rates, is there anything we can learn from the best performers? Is there much variation?
Sam?
Yeah, I think, David, mine was on pick-up of cancers and where we're picking them up.
Yep.
Where are we heading in that direction? So what's the sort of rate of positivity in the 2-week referral from primary care? And where are we in terms of reducing the numbers that first present in A&E with cancer? And then finally, what are the sorts of things that we need to do, say, for example, continuity of care, to up the early pickup?
Yeah, thank you. So if you maybe go vaccines, where's the variation? What are we doing about it? How do we learn from it? How do we compare with other countries in terms of that overall life expectancy? I think Sam's point, which I know, maybe Mark picks that up. I've been doing a lot of work on all those questions, and then for our performance.
Yeah. So, firstly, in terms of vaccine, that's something we can look into in greater detail. I don't know, Amanda, if you've got any further detail on this.
So there is significant variation with regard to the childhood vaccines, where we often see the biggest variations. There are specific parts of the country that are a challenge. London is always significantly less served. They are in fact doing quite a lot of work, and it's cultural and demographic issues that we're looking at. There's quite a lot of targeted work with specific communities. We're also looking at the general practice contract next year, the way in which we incentivise vaccine delivery. At its simplest, there's a bit of an all or nothing cliff edge, and what we want to do is incentivise really increasing the effort in those in the most challenged communities. So we're also looking at that, but we are conscious of that variation.
I think your special advisor on
Just want a couple of additions on this. Actually, there's been a huge amount of work through this summer, bringing all the best performers together with the worst performers, where we've got challenges. We have brought those teams together. What is clear is where there's a huge amount of creativity and where we're bringing the vaccine closer to where people are, there's a correlation between that and uptake. It's not just about sitting back and having a smart campaign and expecting everybody to go to it. You've got to take the vaccine to where people are. It's also a leadership thing. So, throughout the last few weeks in every edition of the week, we've been celebrating all of those folks that are getting the biggest improvements this year. And I do think there's been a little bit of hiding behind vaccine hesitancy over the last couple of years in terms of putting a real effort in. There's some organisations out there this year that have shown huge increases just by really putting some welly into it. So I think there's been a lot of that. There's still clearly more to do.
Just some anecdote, but from a local perspective on vaccine, particularly what's happening right at the moment, we're seeing a lot less older people coming in with vaccine with flu, and seeing a much higher demand in the younger people, and that is almost exclusively, we think, down to vaccination, which is a fantastic public health message which we need to be putting out. So just in terms of life and expectancy, the first thing we'll do is on that slide we will have a look at how we could get good international comparative data that's relevant. I've heard the same as you with regard to particularly some of the Nordic countries again outperforming. I don't want to pick on you, Adrian, whether you had any idea on international.
I think the place to go is actually CMO reports.
Yeah.
Recently have had all these data in, and I don't have them to hand now, but they put us kind of in the middle on this of Europe, and we shouldn't be. We should be better than that. So it is of concern. And of course it will then inevitably lead to either greater demand, treatment costs, and impact on life expectancy over time. So,
and quite a lot of this is being picked up in the quality strategy document as well. Which you'll see,
4 hours trajectory, Sarah Jane.
Yeah, so I think as colleagues have said, both of these metrics are essentially stuck. They go up and down a little bit based on demand, but there's not really been any significant movement in them as there needs to be. So we're currently doing a piece of work with the Royal Colleges, Emergency Medicine, Acute Medicine Society and so on, to look at what a well-performing emergency department and the services that sit behind, so the same-day emergency care, the medical assessment units, and to codify what the high performers, those that do achieve the targets, because we do have a group that do, what is it that they do in terms of the clinical and operational processes? How does it work? How do the clinicians work? And then we'll have a big collective effort next year with leadership across the NHS to implement that in each of our organisations. I don't think, if I'm honest, at the moment with the winter, the pressures that we're under, we need to focus on safety rather than performance over the next 6 to 8 weeks. But when we're out the other side, these best practice models will be ready to go, and then we need to really work with the service and our clinical and operational leaders to get them implemented through the course of next year.
And then finally, just to Sam's points around pickup, I will see how we could include that data here. I can give an example from a North London perspective. Across all of the providers there, the actual pickup of cancer on the 2-week hasn't changed dramatically in the key areas of prostate, breast, and GI improved as a result, obviously, of bowel screening. The area where we have seen significant improvement, and this also leads into people presenting with cancer, is in lung, and those associated with the screening programs that have been rolled out, where we're seeing that diagnostic change by almost a stage and much better interaction with early presentation. But it's a really important factor to your point around how effective 2-week wait is. So we will look at how best we could present that.
Mark, do you want to add anything?
The only thing I would add is I completely agree with David's point about the success with lung cancer screening, because we're starting to pick up more stage 1 and 2 cancers than previously, where we would see patients presenting in ED with stage 4 and 5. So, and obviously with very limited opportunities for interventions to have an impact on a patient's life. So we have seen an increase in the number of referrals and patients coming through the 2-week wait pathway, but the incidence is not increasing beyond the modelling that we had assumed. So what we are seeing is, because there's long waits in some elective pathways, increased use of urgent suspected cancer routes. So we're doing some work on this now to make sure that we have the right referral options available to GPs, to make sure patients they're concerned about can get the appropriate treatment quickly, but without sitting in the queue to see on a cancer pathway.
But I think it's 5%, isn't it, at the moment? Yeah.
Yeah.
So 5% of referrals do have cancer.
Yeah.
Okay, right. Should we go on to finance?
Yep, happy to pick it up. So month 6 finance, so I'll pick it up in 3 chunks if I may. The first will be the revenue position, so broadly balanced, reporting a £55 million overspend in non-ring-fenced RDEL at the end of September. What you'll see though within the table, table 1, that the actual material or large part of the overspend is actually at a system level, so that's 289 million at a service level. That's a combination of costs, we believe, related to industrial action. There's an element of deficit support funding that's been held back, and we obviously we can see that some of the provider plans, particularly around some of the workforce changes that they anticipated making earlier in the year, haven't actually materialised. Slippage on efficiency plans is one of our central drivers around some of the workforce costs, but again, we are looking at this at quite a granular level, and it's not a universal picture, which previous years we would have seen it across all systems. It's worth highlighting perhaps the system position. So 6 systems account for more than half of the total overspend, and you can see that information within the pack. And despite the position that I'm describing, which is good actually, relatively good, this is a much stronger position than we saw last year. So those 6 systems, now we've got, so it's 22 systems, and 68% of providers are actually delivering their plan at this stage of the year in month 6. And that picture looks like it's going through into month 7. This time last year, the variance would have been around about 700 million. So again, just in terms of relativity. The next topic, if I may, just because it's been a topic that some board members have asked me about, is cash. I just want to assure everybody, actually, that at the start of the year we made sure that all providers, all systems had sufficient cash to actually deliver their board-approved plans. if there was anyone that didn't have sufficient cash at the start of the year, when we looked at their plans, we worked with them and they started with a cash injection. Clearly that meant that they had sufficient cash if they delivered their plan. If people go off plan, then obviously people are starting to have some cash issues. The handful of providers that have actually come in and requested PZC or cash support because of inadequate spending control and etc., which is obviously something that's very much a responsibility of the board. We've worked very closely with those, absolutely ensuring that there is no risk to patients or staff, making sure they've got the sufficient cash to continue to operate. However, for those particular providers or systems that come in for cash support because they've gone off plan, we put some strict conditions in. So we make sure they've got cash, we make sure there's no risk to staff, suppliers or patients. But what we have got is a level of scrutiny, and we're asking for clear evidence at a board level that actions are being taken to address the overspend. I think that's really important, and if I could just see the context, quite often people talk to me about the context of having to manage low cash levels and how difficult it can be. I think for every one person that asks me about that, I've got more than two that are asking me about allocations at the moment and the move to fair shares. So people are quite distressed that someone else is spending their money and overspending. So effectively, we have to make sure we've got clear accountability around cash management. But just to give board assurance, we are looking at this very closely. The position on productivity is within the pack. So again, we're ahead of track and an improving position month on month, which is always very positive. And then looking ahead to the year end, where we obviously forecasting we're on plan. There are some material backloaded plans, so we are working closely with 16 systems around that. But again, just to give you the board assurance, in the majority of places the run rate has improved and continues to improve at month 7. Our agency whole time equivalents are down 46% compared to last year. Our bank spend is down 10% because a lot of people have said, have you just switched from agency to bank? And in total, the saving across agency bank for this first part of the year is in around about £1 billion more than last year. So all of the clear signs are telling us that this isn't people manipulating numbers. We can see clear evidence year to date that these numbers are coming down. And I just want to say thank you actually to everyone, because it's been amazing work. Whilst at the same time, we've heard about the performance improvements today. So really good. And I guess there are some challenge systems, but through the mid-year review process, I don't think we came across one that said they weren't pushing ahead for the remainder of this year to try to deliver their plan and dig in deep.
Okay, good, thank you. Any other, Mark?
So the big strategic changes in the 10-year plan clearly haven't been delivered yet. So what changed from where we were to where we are? Because this is a pretty transformational change in the financial position of the system. Down to clearly amazing executive leadership.
I honestly think it's been the clarity and the transparency that everybody and his people and the discipline actually of understanding there's no bailouts, there's no money for bailouts. We work really closely with systems during the planning stage to try and help them to get to a place with robust plans at huge pace. So there are some aspects of the plans that, like the activity plan triangulation, not as good as it could be. But I honestly think, particularly speaking to the CFO community, this is day in, day out, and not just technical efficiency. This is about clinically led change that's happening on the ground, and there's pockets of it actually, and when we come on to a productivity conversation later today, we can describe to you where we can see just pockets of excellence across the NHS, and we've just got to make sure we learn from that and spread it across the piece. But just some of the statistics we talked about this morning, £500 million that could be saved through not having some A&E attendances turn up that quite frankly don't need to go there. They don't even need an alternative. They don't need anything. So there's a lot to go at, and it feels quite exciting. But equally, I'm really conscious of the operational context that Jim and Sarah James described. And it's, I was at the HFMA, there's a HFMA event going on currently, and I met with the young group of senior leaders coming through. And they said to me, oh, you know, your job's really important type of thing. What's the most difficult thing about your job? And I said, time. So much to go at. It's being able to make sure that we are structured in a way that we can focus on the things that matter most, because we can make a difference here.
I'll come back to that. HFMA is Healthcare Finance Management Association. Is that right? Yeah.
It is, yeah.
Okay, so I've got Sam and then Glenn, and then we will move on.
So I think I'm right in saying the figures around sickness absence are 4 times the rate that you would expect in the private sector. What that creates massive clinical and financial pressure. What sort of things have you planned to address that?
Yeah, so
hang on, let's have Glenn's question as well first.
So I was just going to talk about the work that Elizabeth's team have done to get the planning framework and the financial rules for next year into play, because I think the context of moving to a rules-based fair shares approach is affecting behaviour already in this year, and I think that's part of why it's improving.
Yeah, good, helpful to hear that. So let's talk a bit about sickness and then
I didn't know, Joe, if you wanted to come in as well. Do you want to go first? Or?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Yeah, I mean, private sector count it differently to us, we would argue, but yes, it is over and above what it should be. So in the 10-year plan, we said traditionally it was about 5% now, but we set an ambition to reduce that by 1 percentage point to 4.1% per annum, which is the best it's been, I think, since about 2014. So that doesn't sound like a lot, 1%, but 1% on 1.6 million people is actually a lot. So there's a lot of work we're putting into that as part of the medium-term planning guide. That's like one of the top priorities the service have got, because bank and agency drives sickness rates drives bank and agency rates, as you know. And we've just started to roll out STAR, the staff treatment access service that provides help with mental health, musculoskeletal services, trying to sort of give people the support that they need to reduce that. But it is going to be hard yards. So just to get it down by that 1% is about 14,000 people every year, and all the sort of really close work we're going to have to do with those staff in those places to improve that health. But we're going to do more in the 10-year workforce plan, what we can do as an employer to actually make our staff the healthiest compared to other workforces. I think there's a lot more to go at, but it is an absolute priority for us.
We'll come back and talk about that more into New Year. Okay, so thank you, Elizabeth. We've got one paper to note, which is about looking at improving equality, diversity and inclusion in health and care research. So that's helpful, noted. Thank you. And then we've got 4 questions from members of the public, and I'm going to ask individual colleagues to respond to them. So first of all, Sarah Jane, can you share what's happening in terms of complex paediatric transfer decisions and how we are ensuring that they're made lawfully and within appropriate timeframes?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. It's a really important question, and one with my background I feel very passionately about that we get right. So it's the duty of all clinical teams to record data about decision making around patients, whether that's clinical teams within the same organisation, or in the example of a transfer, the clinical teams between the organisations, particularly where there might be differences of opinion or anything of that nature. It's absolutely incumbent for that to be documented. We do set out the standards that we expect for this as part of, particularly from our specialist paediatric providers, where often the transfers are between, and they're in our national service specifications, which are on our website. It's clear to all providers that they have to work to those specifications. It's part of the standard contract. Where there's evidence of concern, then we'll always look at NHS England if there's any more than we can do. But we think that the existing frameworks and specifications that we have make it really clear what the expectations are. And there's probably not more that mandating would actually do to support this. But obviously we'll constantly survey to see whether we've got any issues that we need to address.
Thank you. And then question for Duncan, please. There have been quite a few questions about the Supreme Court ruling on the legal definition of a woman. What immediate steps will NHS England be taking to implement the Supreme Court ruling?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. So following the Supreme Court ruling in April of this year on the definition of sex in relation to the 2010 Equality Act, NHS England's been reviewing all relevant policies and procedures to ensure that we're aligning with the ruling. However, it's really important that the Equality and Human Rights Commission, so the EHRC, updated code of practice for services, public functions and associations, which sets out the legal framework for how services are delivered in line with the Equality Act, is available before any final decisions can be taken about national policies. So the updated code of practice will be published shortly, subject to parliamentary approval, and then we'll be able to update and issue guidance following that. In terms of the questions that have come through around data collection and recording, so work's ongoing in a number of areas such as the Unified Information Standard for protected characteristics to support the collection of improved equality data on patients and employees around protected characteristics. This will enable NHS organisations to improve care and employment approaches and better respond to legal duties around equalities in relation to protected characteristics under the Equality Act 2010. And then work is also ongoing to address concerns related to clinical safety, data integrity and safeguarding that have arisen in relation to the creation of the new NHS numbers when patients change their gender, and also the terminology used on patient records in relation to sex and gender. This work intends to ensure that patients are not unintentionally excluded from services such related to biology, such as breast or cervical cancer screening programmes. And then in terms of language used in health communications at a national level, work has been ongoing for a number of years now to ensure that information for patients on sex-specific conditions and treatments is clearly understood. So the approach taken on this is to use additive language. So, for example, explaining that cervical screening services are available to women and people with a cervix to ensure that language is clear and inclusive. So NHS organisations should always consult the NHS data model and dictionary to ensure that local information is aligned to best practice. So I'm sure we will update the board as soon as we've made changes to the guidance.
Okay, thank you, Duncan. And then for Elizabeth, how does both NHS England and DHSC ensure that nationally agreed best prices secured through the NHS supply chain frameworks are implemented across ICBs and trusts?
Okay, yeah, so we recommend and encourage ICBs and trusts to use the NHS supply chain to secure best value, but we don't actually mandate it outside of something we call the NHS core list, and therefore we don't formally report on this in terms of the use of the supply chain. However, there is quite a lot of information that's available within the NHS spend comparison service, so that information is out there. We are working with the NHS supply chain to launch the NHS core list of products imminently. And as we've been talking about the refresh on planning, that will actually go into the standard contract. And that core list goes live in January, actually. So further progress on this, and further phase 2 of the projects will go live in Q1 of 26-27. So we'll start rolling that out.
Okay, thank you. And then final one for Matthew. Why did NHS England allow gender identity clinics to withhold outcome data from the CAS review, and what governance and oversight of gender identity clinics is currently in place?
Thank you. So it's worth being clear that Dr. Cass, in the CAS review, recommended that it was necessary to complete both the data linkage study and a wider programme of research. So NHS England, working with the Department of Health and Social Care, are taking both of those pieces of work forward. That includes work ensuring that the right statutory and non-statutory governance is in place for the data linkage study, and working very closely with clinics to minimise any delays in the sharing of data, so that both of those pieces of work can progress at pace. Alongside the data linkage study, as I said, the Pathways trial was launched by King's College London at the end of November. Again, in line with Dr. Cass's recommendations. In respect of the clinics, the transformation of those gender services is progressing. We've already seen 3 services go fully operational and work to the fundamentally different model of care which has been set out. That's in the northwest, the southwest and London. There will be a fourth service in the east of England going live in the new year, and more will follow in 26, 27 as part of the programme of work of improving both quality and access of care for this population.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you all very much. That concludes the formal business. Is there anything anyone else wants to raise? No? Okay. So I'd like to take this opportunity, first of all, to thank people who have turned up in person to join the board, or those who are watching these proceedings. I'd very much like to thank all of the staff out there. As Jim mentioned, particularly a number of people are having to go above and beyond to cover for industrial action and cover across the holiday season. Particularly want to note, Elizabeth said, what's the hardest thing? Time. And I think it is probably fair to say that all of the executives around this table at the moment are certainly working 6-day weeks, if not 7-day weeks for a number of people, and working very long days, and that is exhausting. So first off, thank you to everybody, because people are absolutely going above and beyond to do everything from whether it's Joe doing work on industrial action, you know, Mark's doing work on cancer plan and so on, Sarah Jane obviously on winter, Elizabeth's, well, I won't go through everybody. We're relieved to know.
In order to you missed out though.
It's a selective. But a big thanks seriously to everyone, because it has been exhausting, but I do hope that everyone makes sure that they find a way to take some time off. And look forward to being back in January. So thank you all. Thank you for all that you do. Much appreciated.